Grief makes people underestimate you, and predators count on that moment of weakness. I stood beneath a slate-colored sky outside a grand stone basilica in Ravenport, the air heavy with mist and unspoken intentions. Black vehicles lined the avenue like a silent procession of power, their tinted windows reflecting a life that no longer existed. I wore mourning silk that felt less like fabric and more like armor, holding me upright when everything inside wanted to collapse. Beside me, my daughter Alara stood frozen, her face hidden behind a veil so carefully chosen it felt more strategic than sorrowful. Her husband, Marcus Hale, rested a hand on her shoulder, an image of support for the cameras, but to me it felt like a marker being placed. We had just buried Caleb Whitmore, my husband of nearly 4 decades. A man who began with calloused hands and relentless vision and ended as the architect of a skyline that reshaped the coast. He was my partner in every risk, my compass when the world demanded certainty. As officials and executives offered rehearsed condolences, a colder realization crept in. Marcus wasn't looking at me with sympathy. He was studying me, measuring loss, calculating opportunity, watching a throne suddenly unguarded. The ride back to the cliffside estate was silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The house Caleb built to feel like refuge now felt exposed, its glass walls reflecting too much light, its corridors stretching like unanswered questions. I retreated to the study, the room that still carried the scent of old paper and cedar, where Caleb and I once mapped out our charitable work late into the night. I needed one moment that still belonged to me. I didn't get it. The doors closed with a deliberate click. Marcus poured himself a drink from a decanter he had no right to touch, already moving as if ownership had quietly shifted. Alara followed, pale and restless, avoiding my gaze as she sat. Marcus placed the glass down with surgical precision. "We need to address the transition," he said calmly. "There's a significant financial gap left by Caleb's absence. The board is uneasy. Given everything you're dealing with, it's only responsible to simplify oversight." The words sounded reasonable. That's how traps are set. He spoke of asset protection, of temporary safeguards, of numbers large enough to make most people dizzy, figures I knew by heart because I helped build them. He slid a folder across the desk, dense with language meant to intimidate and exhaust. When he mentioned concerns about my recent judgment, something inside me went very still. I looked to Alara, searching for the daughter who once trusted my instincts without question. What I saw instead was distance, quiet, conditioned compliance. In that moment, I understood something terrifyingly clear. I wasn't just mourning my husband, I was being positioned. And while they believed grief had weakened me, they had no idea what Caleb and I had prepared for moments exactly like this. The most dangerous betrayals don't arrive loudly, they speak in calm voices and wear polite smiles. Marcus stepped closer to the desk, his shadow swallowing the warm glow of the reading lamp. His tone softened, practiced, almost compassionate, the kind used by professionals who know exactly how to sound reasonable while dismantling you piece by piece. He explained market volatility, risk exposure, and the importance of decisive leadership, all while subtly framing me as a liability disguised as a widow. He told me he had already taken precautions. Certain accounts, he said, had been temporarily restricted, nothing drastic, just a pause, a safeguard, words chosen to soothe, not inform. He spoke as though this were already settled, as though my consent were a courtesy rather than a requirement. The folder in front of me felt heavier than paper should. Inside were authorization pages, committees, oversight clauses, structures that didn't protect legacy but absorbed it. I didn't need to read every line to recognize the cage being assembled. I turned to Alara. My voice barely rose above a whisper when I asked her if she truly believed I was no longer capable. If she thought the life her father and I built could be reduced to risk assessments and signatures made under pressure. She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Marcus answered for her. He mentioned irregularities, minor discrepancies. Framed them as concerns raised by unnamed advisors. He said outside intervention could become unavoidable if things weren't handled responsibly. The implication hung in the air like smoke: comply now or be forced later. The room seemed to shrink. The walls, once filled with shared memories and plans, now listened like witnesses to a quiet execution. I realized then that grief had been weaponized against me not as an emotion but as a diagnosis. I stood, joints stiff, spine straight. I felt Caleb with me in that moment, not as a memory but as a presence that refused to let me fold. I told Marcus I would not sign anything that night. That this house, this legacy, still answered to me. He didn't argue. That was the most unsettling part. Instead, he gathered the documents with measured patience, offering a look of manufactured concern. He said I should rest, reflect. That the measures already in place were merely temporary and for everyone's benefit. As he guided Alara toward the door, his hand rested possessively on her shoulder, his control subtle but absolute. When the room finally emptied, the silence felt earned but not peaceful. I sat where Caleb used to sit, the weight of my ring pressing into my finger like a reminder of vows made in strength, not comfort. The shock faded, replaced by clarity sharp enough to cut. They believed I was diminished, manageable, a remnant of a past era. They were wrong. I reached beneath the desk, my fingers finding the concealed compartment Caleb once showed me during a quiet night filled with half-finished plans and unspoken contingencies. When my hand closed around cold metal, something inside me ignited. This wasn't surrender. This was activation. Because the moment they decided I was finished was the exact moment the real defense quietly came online. They thought freezing my access would freeze my power, but power doesn't always live where they expect it to. The silver key rested in my palm like a heartbeat from the past. Caleb had pressed it into my hand years ago during one of our quieter evenings, the kind where the world outside felt distant and manageable. If anything ever feels wrong, he had said, not dramatic, just deliberate, this is where you start. I hadn't asked questions then. We never did when it came to safeguards. Trust was our currency. I slid into his chair and opened the hidden compartment fully. Inside was not money, not jewels, but something far more dangerous: access. A small, encrypted drive, dormant and overlooked, shielded from the systems Marcus clearly believed he controlled. I powered on the old terminal Caleb insisted on keeping separate from the estate's network. As the screen came to life, so did a version of myself I hadn't needed in years. Files appeared one by one, neatly labeled, meticulously organized. Contingency frameworks, asset redundancies. Names, real names connected to loyalty rather than convenience. Caleb had never trusted visible structures alone. He believed true security lived in relationships, favors earned quietly, and truths documented long before they were needed. I navigated deeper, finding a directory marked with a single word: resurgence. Inside were records of properties never tied directly to the public estate, holdings shielded by distance and jurisdiction, and communication logs with people who didn't answer to boards or titles, but to principles. This wasn't panic planning, it was foresight. The realization settled heavily. Marcus hadn't dismantled my world. He had only stepped into a maze without realizing I helped design it. I checked my phone. Predictably, most access points were restricted. Calls failed, messages stalled, but one line still pulsed quietly in the corner of the screen, a secure relay Caleb had insisted remain analog adjacent, unassuming, and undocumented. I dialed. The voice on the other end answered immediately, steady and unsurprised. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I identified myself and stated only that the safeguards were being tested earlier than expected. The response was calm. Prepared, almost reassuring. We spoke briefly, names exchanged, confirmations made, movements initiated that would never show up on Marcus's dashboards. The kind of actions that don't announce themselves until it's far too late to intervene. When the call ended, I leaned back and finally allowed myself a breath. The house was still too quiet, the loss still real, Illyra still unreachable behind layers of influence I didn't yet know how to dismantle. But I was no longer blind. They believed they had isolated me financially, emotionally, strategically. What they had actually done was give me time, space, silence. And silence, when used correctly, is a weapon. Because while they were celebrating control, the pieces they never saw were already moving into position. Control isn't taken all at once, it's tested in small humiliations meant to make you forget who you are. Morning light crept through the tall windows, too bright for how cold the house felt. I entered the breakfast room and stopped short. The space had changed overnight, furniture shifted, personal items removed. Blueprints spread across the table where family meals once anchored us. Marcus sat there already, perfectly composed, while his mother Rowena Hale studied the plans like a conqueror surveying new territory. They spoke freely, not bothering to lower their voices. Words like modernization, repositioning, and branding floated through the air, replacing the language of legacy and care. A portrait that had hung in the main hall for decades was discussed as if it were an outdated accessory. Rowena dismissed it with a flick of her hand, saying it no longer fit the direction of the estate. When Marcus finally acknowledged me, his expression was rehearsed concern. He said they were simplifying the environment to help me heal. Movers had been scheduled, rooms reassigned, decisions made without consultation. Not one word asked, only delivered. The changes didn't stop there. Meals became inconsistent. Doors once open now closed quietly before I reached them. Conversations ended when I entered a room. Staff I had known for years were replaced with unfamiliar faces who avoided eye contact and deferred exclusively to Marcus. It wasn't aggression, it was something colder, administrative erasure. Illyra drifted through it all like a shadow. She sat silently while her husband spoke for her, nodded when prompted, and avoided my gaze when I searched for recognition. The daughter who once challenged me fiercely now deferred to someone who framed obedience as protection. The intent became unmistakable: reduce me, document the reduction, then formalize it. I retreated to the study whenever I could, the last space not yet reorganized beyond recognition. There, I began observing instead of reacting. I noted what changed and when, who spoke to whom, what documents moved through Marcus's briefcase and which ones he guarded too closely. At night, when the house settled into false calm, I reviewed surveillance feeds Caleb had installed years ago under the guise of security upgrades. The cameras told a story no one realized I was still reading: discussions about finances, plans discussed too openly, moments of frustration when I didn't comply quickly enough. They believed deprivation would make me desperate. Instead, it made me precise: every slight, every removed object, every whispered assumption about my decline was catalogued not emotionally but strategically. This wasn't endurance anymore, it was evidence collection. They were so focused on managing me that they forgot to manage themselves. And the more comfortable they became treating me like an obstacle, the more they exposed exactly how far they were willing to go. The moment they stop hiding their cruelty is the moment they believe you're already defeated. The nights were the worst, not because of fear, but because of clarity. When the house fell silent and the curated concern disappeared, I heard the truth moving through the walls. Voices carried farther at night. Carelessness crept in with confidence. I would leave my room quietly, barefoot against the cold floor, moving through corridors that once echoed with laughter. In the kitchen, I survived on what I could manage without confrontation: simple, forgettable meals meant to leave no trace. Hunger became another tool they used, subtle enough to deny, consistent enough to weaken. Or so they thought. One evening, I stopped short outside the study. Marcus's voice cut through the door, sharp and impatient, stripped of its public polish. He spoke as if I were an object, an obstacle between him and completion. He complained about delays, about how long it was taking to finalize matters, about how exhausting it was to pretend patience. Ilara responded softly, too softly. Her voice carried uncertainty but not resistance. She asked questions framed as worries, not objections. Would I notice certain changes? Would I remember conversations the same way? Would I question authority if it arrived with paperwork and professional signatures? Marcus laughed. That laugh did something irreversible to me. It wasn't relief. It wasn't affection. It was ownership. The sound of someone already dividing what they believed was theirs. I returned to my room without a sound, my resolve hardening into something immovable. That was the night I stopped hoping for understanding and started preparing for exposure. From then on, every interaction became intentional. I let them correct me, let them repeat themselves. Let them explain things slowly with that faint condescension they mistook for kindness. I nodded. I forgot small details on purpose. I allowed the narrative they were constructing to continue uninterrupted. Meanwhile, the other narrative, the real one, grew stronger. The surveillance logs expanded. Audio files layered over video. Patterns emerged. Financial discussions timed around my absence. Consultations with professionals who never once spoke directly to me. Decisions framed as mercy. What disturbed me most wasn't Marcus's ambition. It was Ilara's silence. I saw her sitting alone late at night, staring at nothing. I watched her flinch when Marcus raised his voice, then rationalize it moments later. She was being unmade quietly, just as I was, only she didn't realize it yet. That knowledge became fuel. This was no longer about reclaiming control. It was about stopping a cycle before it consumed her entirely. They believed I was fading. In truth, I was watching everything. Because when people assume you're no longer paying attention, they reveal the evidence that destroys them. They plan to erase me legally, but arrogance always leaves fingerprints. The turning point came disguised as concern. A man arrived one afternoon with a practiced smile and a leather bag, introduced as a routine specialist brought in to check on me. His questions were gentle on the surface, but they followed a script I recognized immediately. Dates, names, orientation, traps designed to provoke hesitation and document doubt. I answered calmly, precisely, too precisely. I watched Marcus from the corner of my eye as the exchange unfolded. Each correct answer tightened his jaw. He had expected confusion, needed it. When the man finally left, Marcus's politeness slipped for half a second before snapping back into place. That was all I needed to see. That night, the surveillance feed showed Marcus pacing the study, phone pressed to his ear, voice tight with urgency. He spoke in fragments about timelines, about impatience, about needing to move things before questions start being asked. The words "final transfer" landed with weight. They were escalating. I reached for the secure relay again, hands steady now. I relayed what I'd seen, what I'd recorded, what I knew was coming next. The response on the other end was immediate and controlled. Instructions followed, not dramatic, not rushed, methodical. Stay visible, stay compliant, let them cross the line. The days that followed felt like theater. I played the role they wrote for me: quiet, distracted, cooperative. Marcus grew bolder, documents appeared more frequently, conversations grew louder, sloppier. He believed victory was a matter of scheduling. Behind the scenes, everything changed. External audits began quietly. Digital markers embedded themselves where Marcus assumed privacy. Every conversation about moving funds, every instruction to expedite signatures, every dismissive remark about my capacity was preserved with clinical precision. Allura sensed the shift but couldn't name it. She hovered between guilt and obedience, trapped in the version of reality Marcus fed her. I didn't confront her, not yet. She needed the truth whole, not fragmented by fear. Late one evening, I watched Marcus on the feed open a binder thicker than the others, red tabs marking urgency. He spoke into his phone with forced confidence, confirming figures and deadlines. The number he quoted wasn't just reckless. It was criminal. That was the moment the last safeguard engaged. What they believed was a finishing move was actually a confession, one made in the comfort of assumed control. I shut down the feed and sat in the dark, the house humming softly around me. I felt no panic, no anger, just certainty. They thought they were pushing me toward an exit. Instead, they were walking directly into the light. And once that line was crossed, there was no version of this story where they walked away untouched. They thought the end was scheduled, but they never realized the clock wasn't working for them. The morning everything shifted felt deceptively ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the estate, warm and indifferent, illuminating a house buzzing with quiet urgency. Boxes lined the hallways, movers spoke in low voices. Finality hung in the air, disguised as efficiency. I watched from the threshold as Marcus moved through the space with sharpened confidence. He gave instructions without hesitation, already acting like the outcome was sealed. His phone barely left his hand. Every few minutes he checked the time. I knew why. The transfer was imminent. In the study, the red binder lay open beside a secured laptop, cables snaking across the desk like veins. Marcus paced, rehearsing explanations no one had asked for yet. His certainty bordered on impatience. This was supposed to be the moment everything locked into place, the final step that would make resistance irrelevant. I entered the room quietly. Marcus barely looked up at first. When he did, his expression hardened into practiced authority. He told me I should be resting, that arrangements had already been made, that the car would arrive soon. Every word framed as care, every sentence designed to push me out of my own life. I didn't argue. I reached into my pocket and placed the small silver key on the desk between us. The sound it made was insignificant, but the effect wasn't. Marcus paused, truly paused. For the first time since Caleb's funeral, he looked uncertain, not afraid yet, just unsettled. He asked what I thought I was doing, his tone tightening as if control could be restored by volume. I spoke calmly. I told him I knew about the conversations he thought were private, the evaluations he had arranged, the transfers he had scheduled. I mentioned details he hadn't shared with anyone in the house. The color drained from his face in stages. Rowena appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shift in tone. Illyra followed, confusion written across her face as she took in the scene, the laptop, the binder, the stillness that felt wrong. Marcus laughed, sharp and forced, dismissing my words as confusion fueled by grief. He reached for the binder as if paper could shield him from consequence. That's when the front doors opened, not gently, not quietly. The sound carried authority. Footsteps echoed across marble with purpose, not permission. Voices followed, clear, unmistakable, immune to argument. The room filled quickly. Identification presented. Commands issued. Movement controlled. Marcus froze mid-motion, his hand hovering uselessly above the desk. Rowena's composure shattered instantly. Illyra stepped back, breath catching as reality recalibrated around her. I remained where I was, silent, steady, because this moment wasn't about triumph, it was about inevitability. And as they finally realized whose game they had been playing, the truth arrived with nowhere left to hide. The most terrifying moment for a manipulator is when the story flips and they're no longer the narrator. The room that once bent to Marcus's voice now moved without acknowledging him at all. People spoke over him, past him, around him. His questions went unanswered. His objections were noted and dismissed. Authority had shifted, not dramatically but absolutely. Documents were collected, devices secured, conversations replayed aloud with a neutrality that stripped them of all context and all mercy. Words Marcus had once spoken casually now sounded grotesque in the open air. Plans he believed were clever revealed themselves as crude and impatient. Rowena tried to intervene first. She demanded explanations, status recognition. None came. Her outrage collapsed into disbelief as the reality settled. Reputation offered no protection here. Illyra stood frozen near the window, watching a version of her life disintegrate in real time. Her eyes moved between Marcus and me, searching for an anchor. I didn't speak yet. This wasn't the moment for comfort. It was the moment for clarity. When Marcus finally spoke again, his voice was smaller. He tried to explain, to reframe, to position himself as a misunderstood caretaker caught in unfortunate timing. He said words like intentions and concern as if they still held meaning. They didn't. What remained were records, timelines, signed instructions. Conversations preserved without emotion or embellishment. The truth doesn't need volume, it just needs space. As he was escorted away from the desk he had claimed too confidently, Marcus looked at me one last time, not with anger. Not even fear, with disbelief. He had built his entire strategy on one assumption, that grief had made me fragile, that time had softened me into something manageable, that silence meant surrender. He never considered that silence could mean patience. Rowena followed soon after, her composure unraveling with each step. The house seemed to exhale as they left it behind, like a body releasing something toxic it had held too long. When the room finally cleared, I turned to Alara. She was shaking, not from shock but from understanding. The kind that rearranges memory and forces you to see moments you excused too easily. She didn't apologize immediately. She didn't need to. Her face carried the weight of what recognition costs. I told her the truth without cruelty. That control often disguises itself as protection. That isolation doesn't begin with walls but with whispers. That trust, once redirected, can become a leash. She listened, really listened. Outside, the house settled into a new quiet, not the suffocating kind, the honest kind that follows resolution. I returned the silver key to my pocket, its purpose fulfilled, but not exhausted. This wasn't the end. It was the restoration of authorship. Because taking back your life doesn't happen in one dramatic moment, it unfolds in what you choose to do with the power you reclaim next. Winning the battle is loud, but rebuilding your life is the quiet work that truly defines victory. The days that followed moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself needed to relearn its rhythm. The house no longer felt hostile, but it didn't feel healed either. It was a structure waiting to be reinhabited with truth. Rooms once rearranged to disorient me were restored piece by piece, not to how they were, but to how they should be now. I walked the halls each morning not as a survivor reclaiming territory, but as a steward deciding what deserved to remain. Some things were returned to their places, others were removed entirely. Legacy, I realized, isn't preservation, it's discernment. Alara stayed, not out of obligation but uncertainty. She moved carefully, as if afraid any wrong step would collapse what little stability she had left. We spoke sparingly at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths need space before they can breathe. When she finally apologized, it wasn't dramatic. No tears, no rehearsed regret, just ownership. She acknowledged what she ignored, what she rationalized, what she allowed because it was easier than confronting the person she loved. I didn't forgive her immediately. Forgiveness without accountability is just erasure wearing compassion's mask. Instead, I gave her purpose. Responsibility, work that required her to see what unchecked control does to others. I told her rebuilding trust wasn't a speech, it was consistency over time. She accepted that without argument, and in that acceptance I saw the first sign of her returning to herself. Beyond the estate, consequences continued unfolding. Systems corrected, oversight reestablished. Networks that once fed on silence were exposed to light they couldn't survive, not through spectacle but through process. That was always Caleb's philosophy. Real justice doesn't need an audience, it needs permanence. I stood one evening by the window, watching the horizon darken into something calm instead of threatening. The weight I had carried since the funeral had shifted, not vanished, but transformed. Grief no longer defined me, it informed me. I understood then that what they tried to steal wasn't just money or authority, it was narrative. They wanted to rewrite my life with me edited out of the margins. They failed, because resilience doesn't announce itself, it waits, it watches. And when the moment comes, it moves with precision. I wasn't restored to who I was before the loss. I was reshaped into someone far more deliberate. And if you think this story was about revenge, you've missed the most important truth. It was always about refusing to disappear. Survival isn't the end of the story. What you build after betrayal is what proves who you truly are. The estate feels different now, not quieter, not louder, just honest. Sunlight reaches places it couldn't before, as if the walls themselves have let go of something corrosive. I walk through rooms that once felt like traps and feel nothing but steadiness. No fear, no doubt, just presence. I visit the garden most mornings. Soil under my hands reminds me that growth doesn't rush, it responds to care. Ilara often joins me. We work side by side in silence, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as practice. Trust isn't rebuilt through declarations, it's rebuilt through showing up again and again when it would be easier not to. Beyond these walls, change continues quietly. Structures have been corrected, safeguards strengthened. Resources redirected where they were always meant to go, toward protection, not exploitation. What once felt like an ending has become a point of origin for something far more intentional. I no longer define myself by what was taken from me. Loss reshaped me, yes, but it didn't erase me. Betrayal didn't hollow me out. It clarified me. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It's an advantage if you survive long enough to use it. People like Marcus believe power comes from control, from reducing others until resistance feels pointless. They mistake silence for surrender and grief for incapacity, but they forget something essential. Those who have built lives from nothing know how to rebuild from ashes. I am no longer guarding what I have out of fear of losing it. I am shaping what comes next with intention, boundaries, and clarity. The legacy continues not because it was defended, but because it evolved. If you're listening to this and you feel buried under betrayal, dismissed by those who should have protected you, understand this. The dirt thrown on you isn't the end. It's the ground where your strength roots itself. You don't need to announce your comeback. You don't need permission to reclaim your life. You just need patience, truth, and the courage to outlast the lie. This story wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to vanish. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength waiting beneath the surface, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Like the video, comment your thoughts below, and thank you for watching. Your support keeps stories like this alive.